The air in the briefing container was thick with the smell of stale coffee, sweat, and condescension. Warrant Officer Anya Sharma stood at the back, perfectly still, a ghost in a room full of solid, swaggering men. Her uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp enough to cut, but it was the uniform of a logistician, a quartermaster, a non-entity in the eyes of the operators arrayed before the map. They were a Marine recon team, force reconnaissance, the tip of the spear. She was, in their world, the person who counted the spears long after they were thrown. Colonel Marcus Thorne, commander of the forward operating base, paced before a holographic map of the Spin Gar mountain range. He was a man carved from granite and impatience, his face a roadmap of old wars and older prejudices. His eyes, chips of blue ice, swept the room and slid right over Anya as if she were a piece of furniture. "The target is code-named the Lair," Thorne barked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Intel suggests it's the primary logistics hub for Al-Quds regional commander. We're not talking a few crates of AKs. We're talking manpads, high-grade explosives, sophisticated comms gear. The stuff that kills our people." He jabbed a thick finger at a pulsating red zone on the map. "The problem is, the mountains are a labyrinth. We've had 3 aerial reconnaissance flights get painted by unseen SAM sites. We can't see it from the sky." He paused, his gaze finally, reluctantly, landing on Anya. "Warrant Officer Sharma's algorithms," he said, the word algorithms tasting like ash in his mouth, "have analyzed satellite imagery, signal intercepts, and old Soviet-era geological surveys. She believes she's pinpointed the entrance to the depot complex based on heat signatures and bedrock density." A few of the Marines exchanged smirks. Bedrock density. It sounded like something you'd discuss in a university geology class, not before a kill-or-be-killed infiltration. "Her analysis puts the entrance here." Thorne indicated a narrow, almost invisible canyon. "Team Mako, you're on point. Sergeant Reyes, you'll lead." Sergeant Mateo Reyes, a man whose muscles had muscles, stepped forward. His jaw was tight, his neck thick. He looked at the map, then threw a dismissive glance toward Anya. "Sir, with respect, my team knows this terrain. My gut tells me this canyon is a classic box trap. The approaches are too clean. The intel feels thin. Your gut, Sergeant, isn't what command is basing this on." Thorne shot back, though a flicker of sympathy showed in his eyes. "They want this confirmed, and they want a real-time logistical assessment of the cache once you find it. Which is why Warrant Officer Sharma will be accompanying you." A heavy silence fell over the room. It wasn't just silence. It was a solid object, a wall of disbelief and irritation. One of the younger Marines, Corporal Davis, the comm specialist, actually snorted before catching Reyes's glare. Reyes's face hardened. "Colonel, we're moving light and fast. We can't afford to carry passengers. This is a non-permissive environment of the highest order." "She's not a passenger, she's an asset," Thorne said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. He turned his back to the team and lowered his voice, but in the tight confines of the container, his words were perfectly clear. He was speaking to Reyes, but the message was for Anya. "Listen to me, Sergeant. I fought this. Command, in their infinite wisdom, wants their analyst on the ground. So here's your order. Keep her out of the way. She carries her own weight, but you are not her bodyguard. If she so much as sprains an ankle, if she slows you down for 1 minute, you find a secure position, you call for evac, and you send her home. We don't have time to babysit a clerk. Is that understood?" "Crystal, sir," Reyes said, his voice tight with resentment. Anya's expression didn't change. Her hands remained clasped loosely behind her back. Her gaze was fixed on the holographic map, her mind already tracing the contour lines, calculating angles of approach, and cross-referencing them with the solar charts that dictated shadow patterns in the deep ravines. She heard them. She heard every word. The dismissal was a physical force, a wave of scorn that washed over her and broke against the shores of her stillness. She was used to it. In her line of work, being underestimated was a form of camouflage. The dismissal became a physical burden an hour later at the gear-up. The Mako team members moved with the fluid economy of men who had done this 100 times. They checked their rifles, balanced their loads, and spoke in a clipped shorthand Anya did not try to penetrate. Reyes strode over to a pile of communal gear. He picked up the heaviest, most awkward piece, a bulky electronic countermeasures module, all sharp angles and poor balance, and dumped it at Anya's feet. "Your share, warrant officer," he said, his tone flat. "Standard load distribution." It was a lie, and they both knew it. That piece of equipment was usually rotated among the strongest members of the team. Giving it to her was a test, a deliberate act of hazing meant to make her quit before she even started. The pack, with her own gear and the ECM module, would be well over 80 pounds. Anya looked at the module, then at Reyes. She didn't argue. She didn't complain. She simply knelt, her movements methodical, and began expertly lashing it to the bottom of her pack, using a series of specific knots that cinched it tight and distributed the weight more evenly than the standard issue straps allowed. She worked her way around the pack, adjusting, tightening, until the unwieldy burden became a solid, integrated part of the whole. When she was done, she stood, settled the pack onto her shoulders, and cinched the hip belt. She took a few steps, her posture perfect, her center of gravity low. The massive weight seemed to settle on her as if it were nothing. Lance Corporal Jien, the team medic, watched her, a flicker of surprise in his otherwise impassive eyes. The knots she used weren't standard army. They were complex, efficient, something you might see on a mountaineering expedition. He said nothing. Anya walked over to the armory cage to draw her weapon. The armorer, expecting her to take a standard M4 carbine, was surprised when she requested an M110A1, the squad-designated marksman rifle. It was longer, heavier, a more specialized and demanding weapon system. "You qualified on this, ma'am?" the armorer asked, skeptical. Anya simply handed him her credentials. He scanned them and his eyebrows shot up. He looked at the screen, then back at her, his expression shifting from doubt to professional deference. He handed over the rifle and several magazines without another word. As she chambered around and conducted a function check, the metallic clack-clack of the bolt carrier group echoing in the sudden quiet, the rest of the team paused. The sound of that specific rifle, in the hands of the woman they had dismissed as a clerk, was a minor but distinct note of dissonance in their world of assumptions. Reyes ignored it. "Time to move," he grunted, turning his back on her. "Let's see how long the analyst keeps up." They boarded the helicopter, the blades whipping the desert dust into a frenzy. Anya took a seat by the door, her rifle held across her lap, her eyes scanning the landscape as it fell away beneath them. She was a silent statue in the midst of the team's boisterous, nervous energy. They were headed into the mountains. Reyes thought he was leading them. Anya knew she was there to bring them back. The Insertion was a high-altitude, low-opening jump in the pre-dawn gloom. The team descended like wraiths into the jagged peaks. Anya's exit from the aircraft was as clean and professional as any of them. She landed with a soft thud, rolling to dissipate the impact, the heavy pack a part of her. She was up and had her weapon ready before Davis, the youngest, had even untangled himself from his parachute lines. It was another small anomaly, another piece that didn't fit their narrative of her, and they filed it away unspoken. For 2 days they moved through the mountains. The terrain was brutal, a vertical world of shattered rock and knife-edge ridges. Reyes, true to his word, set a punishing pace. He took the most difficult routes, the steepest inclines, hoping to break her. He wanted her to call for that evac. He wanted to be proven right. But Anya never faltered. She moved with a steady, relentless rhythm, her breathing controlled, her feet finding purchase on the treacherous scree as if she were born to it. She said nothing, never asked for a break, never complained about the weight of her pack. She simply endured, her quiet presence at the back of the formation becoming a silent rebuke to their expectations. She had argued for a different route during the briefing, a slightly longer path that followed a series of covered wadis and saddles, which her analysis suggested would keep them below the line of sight of potential enemy observation posts. Reyes had scoffed, choosing his gut instead. A direct, aggressive line that took them high onto the exposed ridges. "The high ground is the command ground," he'd said, quoting a textbook maxim. The high ground is also the killing ground. If the enemy has it zeroed, Anya had replied quietly, a remark that was ignored. Now, on the third day, as they traversed a wide, bowl-shaped valley, the sky a brilliant, pitiless blue above them, her words came back to haunt them. The valley floor was a carpet of loose shale and sparse, thorny bushes. Felt wrong. Too open. Too quiet. The natural sounds of the mountain, the wind, the cry of a hawk were absent. "Something's off," Jen murmured, his hand hovering near the grip of his rifle. "Hold up," Reyes commanded, raising a fist. The team froze, sinking to one knee, weapons scanning their sectors. Anya didn't kneel. She remained standing for a second longer, her head tilted, listening. It wasn't a sound she heard, but the lack of one. Then she scanned the ridgeline above them, her eyes moving methodically, ignoring the obvious promontories and focusing on the subtle dips, the insignificant-looking rock clusters. Her optics were better than theirs, designed for analysis, not just targeting. She saw it then, a flicker of distorted light, a heat shimmer where there should be none. Coated lens. "Down," she said, her voice low but carrying an authority that cut through the tension. "Contact. Ridge at 1 o'clock. Multiple." Before she could finish, a strange, warbling hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated in their teeth. A split second later, every piece of advanced electronics they carried went dead. The green glow of Reyes's wrist-mounted GPS vanished. The digital displays on their weapon optics flickered out. Davis cursed, slapping the side of his helmet. "Comms are down. Everything's fried. EMP." The hum faded, replaced by a terrifying silence. And then the mountain itself seemed to explode. It wasn't gunfire. It was more primal. A deep, cracking roar echoed from the ridge above them, the sound of geology being weaponized. Reyes looked up and his face went pale. A massive section of the cliff face, pre-weakened with cutting charges, was shearing off, a tsunami of rock and debris hurtling down towards them. "Scatter!" he screamed, but it was too late. There was nowhere to go. The rockslide was a force of nature unleashed with pinpoint malice. It wasn't meant to bury them all, but to divide and cripple. The main avalanche thundered down the center of the valley, a maelstrom of dust and pulverizing stone that completely obliterated the path they had just taken, cutting off any chance of retreat. A secondary blast sent a shower of smaller, but no less lethal boulders careening directly into their position. Anya had already moved. The moment she heard the crack, she hadn't run away from the blast, but towards a shallow overhang she had clocked minutes earlier. She dove, her heavy pack taking the brunt of a glancing blow from a fist-sized rock, and curled into a tight ball as the world dissolved into a nightmare of noise, dust, and impact. The chaos lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. When the last of the rocks had settled and the thick dust began to clear, the scene was one of utter devastation. The valley was transformed, the path gone, replaced by a massive, impassable scar of fresh rock. The team was scattered. One Marine, PFC Henderson, was dead, his body crushed by a large boulder. Jen, the medic, was dazed but moving, trying to get his bearings. Davis, the comms specialist, was unconscious, a nasty gash on his forehead bleeding freely. And Sergeant Reyes was screaming. A jagged piece of granite, the size of an engine block, had pinned his left leg, crushing it just below the knee. The bone was clearly shattered, the lower part of his leg bent at an unnatural angle. His bravado was gone, replaced by raw animal agony. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep into the survivors. They were deep in enemy territory with no communications, their leader incapacitated, their escape route gone, and at least one dead. They were trapped. They were exposed. And the enemy, who had engineered this catastrophe with such chilling precision, was somewhere up there watching them. Into this vortex of fear and chaos, Anya Sharma moved. She emerged from under the overhang, shaking dust from her shoulders. While Jen was still stumbling towards Davis, Anya was already at Reyes's side. Her face was a mask of detached calm. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't scared. She was processing. "Put pressure here," she ordered the other standing Marine, a corporal named Bell, pointing to a spot high on Reyes's thigh. Femoral artery. Bell, wide-eyed and shaking, did as he was told. Anya unclipped a pouch from her vest. It wasn't a standard-issue IFAK. The contents were more compact, more specialized. She produced a tourniquet and expertly applied it high and tight on Reyes's leg, twisting the windlass with swift, efficient motions until the bright arterial bleeding slowed to a dark ooze. Reyes groaned, his consciousness flickering. "Jian!" Anya's voice cut through the medic's daze. "Get to Davis. Check for concussion, rule out a spinal." "I've got the sergeant." Jian, trained to take the lead in medical emergencies, found himself taking orders. He simply nodded and scrambled over to the unconscious comms specialist. Anya ignored Reyes's groans. She took her shears and cut away his trousers, exposing the mangled limb. It was a ruin of flesh, fabric, and bone. "Compound fracture of the tibia and fibula," she murmured to herself, her assessment clinical. She noticed something else, a smaller, dirt-clogged puncture wound on his hip that everyone else, including Reyes himself, had missed. Piece of shrapnel. She cleaned it quickly, packed it with gauze, and applied a pressure dressing before turning her attention back to the main injury. She worked without wasted motion. She retrieved 2 lightweight splinting rods from her own pack and, using Reyes's rifle as an anchor for traction, began to align the shattered bone. It was a brutal, painful process. Reyes screamed again, a raw, guttural sound that echoed in the silent valley. Anya didn't flinch. She just kept working, her hands steady, her focus absolute. "Bell, give me your canteen," she commanded. Bell handed it over. Anya used the water to clean the worst of the grime from the wound, her movements gentle but firm. She applied a field dressing, then expertly secured the splint. The entire procedure took less than 5 minutes. With Reyes stabilized, she moved. She didn't hunker down. She didn't wait for the shock to pass. She climbed, scrambling 30 feet up the side of the valley to a small, precarious ledge that gave her a better vantage point. The remaining conscious Marines watched her, stunned. She was moving with a climber's grace, utterly exposed to any potential sniper, but she moved as if the thought of danger didn't apply to her. From the ledge, she pulled out a small, powerful monocular and began to scan the ridge from which the ambush had been sprung. Her search was systematic. She wasn't looking for movement. She was looking for anomalies. A patch of rock that was too uniform. A bush that cast the wrong kind of shadow. The telltale signs of a sniper's hide or an observation post. The enemy was patient. They had sprung their trap. Now they would likely wait, letting the mountains and the injuries do their work, picking them off if they tried to move carelessly. After several minutes, she slid back down to the valley floor. Her face was grim. "They're still up there," she said, her voice quiet. "At least 2 positions. They're dug in. They'll expect us to panic and try to climb out the west side. They'll have it covered." Jian had managed to bring Davis around. The young corporal was dazed, his pupils uneven. "Definite concussion," Jian reported, his voice shaky. "He's in no shape to fight." Reyes, pale and sweating, propped himself up on his elbows. His face was a mask of pain and dawning humiliation. The woman he had mocked, the clerk he had tried to break, had just saved his life with a level of competence that dwarfed his own medics. "What's the plan, Sharma?" he rasped, the use of her name a concession. The word warrant officer was still too much for him. Anya was already doing a rapid inventory of their gear. She laid out their remaining water, ammunition, and medical supplies in neat rows. Her movements were a silent lecture in efficiency. "The plan is simple," she said, not looking at him. "We are not going to be here when they come down to check their work. We're not going west. We're not going back the way we came. We're going east." Bell pointed a trembling finger towards the eastern side of the valley. It was a sheer cliff face, a wall of granite that looked utterly impassable. "There's no way up there." "Not up," Anya corrected him. She unrolled her own map from a waterproof tube in her pack. It was a geological survey map, the same kind she had used for her analysis. It was covered in her own precise, coded annotations. The standard military maps the team carried showed the cliff as a solid wall. Hers showed more detail. She pointed to a faint, almost invisible line near the base of the cliff. Old fault line. According to Soviet mining surveys from the 80s, there's a network of solution caves behind this rock face. The entrance is a fissure, no wider than a man's shoulders. It should be right there. She indicated a jumble of fallen rocks at the base of the cliff. It's our only way out. Reyes stared at her, then at the map. Soviet surveys? How the hell did you get those? It's my job, Anya said simply. Logistics is the science of knowing. Knowing where things are, where they're not, and how to get from one to the other. The remaining team members looked at each other. This was beyond anything they had ever encountered. Their entire world had been about tactics, firepower, and physical dominance. Anya's world was about information, and it was becoming terrifyingly clear that information was the more powerful weapon. Okay, she continued, her tone shifting from analyst to field commander. Here's how we move. Bell, you're on point. Jen, you and I will rig a stretcher for the sergeant. We'll take turns with Davis. We're leaving everything non-essential. Extra ammo, Henderson's gear, the ECM module. She looked at the heavy module she had been forced to carry. A faint, ironic smile touching her lips for a fraction of a second. We move in 5 minutes. There were no more arguments. There was no more scorn. There was only the chilling realization that this quiet, unassuming woman was their only hope of survival. As Jen helped her rig a makeshift travois from poles and a poncho for Reyes, he saw the patch on her pack more clearly. It had been partially obscured by a strap before. It wasn't a logistics branch insignia. It was a small, faded, circular patch depicting a stylized dagger overlaid with a key. It was an emblem he had never seen before. What unit is that? He asked, his curiosity overriding the tension. Anya was focused on securing a knot. Without looking up, she answered, Movement control is my current billet. The answer was technically true, but also a complete evasion. Reyes, his mind drifting on waves of pain, saw the patch too. His vision swam, but the image snagged on something in his memory. A story he'd heard from a grizzled old gunnery sergeant in a bar in Djibouti. A legend about a special operations support unit. A group of ghosts who smoothed the path for Tier 1 teams, who could get anything, anywhere, and who were rumored to be more dangerous than the operators they supported. He couldn't remember the name. Something asymmetrical. We need to move, Anya said, her voice pulling him back from the edge. Now! They began the slow, agonizing trek across the valley floor, a broken, desperate little group. Bell moved ahead, rifle up, his head on a swivel. Anya and Jen hauled the travois carrying Reyes, the wounded sergeant biting down on a piece of webbing to keep from crying out as he was jostled over the rocky ground. Davis stumbled behind them, his eyes vacant, his hand held by the other remaining Marine. They were a perfect target. Every scrape of the travois on the rock, every pained grunt from Reyes, felt like a broadcast to the watchers on the ridge. But Anya had chosen their path with meticulous care, keeping to the deepest shadows cast by the afternoon sun, moving from one cluster of boulders to the next. As they neared the cliff face, Bell suddenly froze, dropping to one knee. Movement, he hissed, pointing towards the ridge. 2 men coming down the scree slope. They're coming to check the bodies. Panic flared again. They were still 100 yards from the supposed cave entrance, caught in the open. Nobody move, Anya whispered. Her voice was ice. Don't even breathe. She unslung the M110A1 rifle from her back. With a fluid motion, she lay prone, deployed the bipod, and settled the stock into her shoulder. She pulled a strange-looking device from her pouch, a Kestrel weather meter, and held it up for a moment, reading the wind speed and direction. She made a minute adjustment to the elevation turret on her scope. Through their own optics, the others could barely make out 2 figures, ant-like in the distance, carefully making their way down the mountain. They were over 800 meters away, an impossible shot for a standard rifle in these conditions, especially for someone under this kind of pressure. Anya's breathing slowed. Once, twice. The team watched, mesmerized, as the unassuming warrant officer transformed into something else entirely. She was no longer a logistician. She was a predator. There was no fanfare, no dramatic pronouncement. There was only a controlled exhale and the sharp, heavy crack of the 762mm rifle. The sound was deafening in the silence. A second later, one of the distant figures stumbled and fell, a tiny puff of dust kicking up from the rocks behind him. "One down," she said, her voice utterly flat, as she calmly worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, and chambered a new round. Her eye never left the scope. The second figure had dropped, seeking cover, but he had made a mistake. He had hidden behind a rock that offered concealment from below, but not from Anya's higher angle. She adjusted her aim slightly. Another controlled breath. Another crack. The second figure jerked and then lay still. Silence returned to the valley. Profound, ringing silence. Anya remained prone for another full minute, scanning the ridge. "That's it for now," she said, finally getting up and slinging the rifle. "They know we're alive and they know we're armed. They'll be more cautious now, but it buys us time. Let's go." They reached the base of the cliff. It was a chaotic jumble of boulders, exactly as she had described. "The entrance should be here," she said, pointing to a dark shadow between two massive slabs of granite. Bell squeezed through first. "It's here," he called back, his voice echoing slightly. "It's tight, but it opens up." Getting Reyes through was a nightmare. They had to unstrap him from the travois and physically maneuver his dead weight and splinted leg through the narrow fissure. He passed out from the pain. Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and millennia of darkness. It was a narrow passage that, after 20 feet, opened into a larger cavern. Just as Jen squeezed through, the last man in, the distinctive whump 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 of a mortar tube firing echoed from the ridge. A second later, the ground outside the fissure erupted, showering the entrance with rock and dirt. They had made it with seconds to spare. They were safe for the moment, but they were entombed. For the next 3 days they lived in the twilight world of the caves. Anya was their anchor, their guide, their absolute commander. The darkness and confinement worked on the morale of the Marines, who were used to open spaces and clear fields of fire. The damp cold seeped into their bones. Their food was nearly gone, reduced to a single high-protein bar per person per day. Anya, however, seemed to draw strength from the environment. Her annotated geological map was their Bible. She led them through a labyrinth of passages, some so tight they had to crawl, others opening into vast, cathedral-like caverns where unseen water dripped from stalactites. She found them water, identifying a seep of pure, filtered groundwater that was safe to drink. When their flashlight batteries began to die, she showed them how to make torches from strips of cloth torn from Henderson's uniform, smeared with the grease from their weapon maintenance kits. The flickering, primitive light cast monstrous shadows on the walls, but it was better than the absolute dark. The journey was a slow, grueling hell. Moving Reyes was the biggest challenge. They took turns, their muscles screaming in protest, their bodies bruised and scraped. Davis's concussion left him disoriented and nauseous, another liability. Through it all, Anya was a machine. She took more than her share of carrying the wounded. She navigated with unerring accuracy, and she kept watch while the others collapsed into exhausted sleep. During one of the rest periods, in the dim, flickering light of a makeshift torch, Reyes, lucid for a while, watched her clean the M110. Her hands moved with a familiar, practiced precision that he had only ever seen in the most elite armorers and snipers. "Asymmetric warfare group," he rasped, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. Anya paused, her hands stilling over the rifle's bolt carrier. She looked at him. Her eyes in the firelight were dark and unreadable. "I heard stories," Reyes continued, his voice barely a whisper, "about an AWG advisor in the Chronicles. They called her the Weaver, Said she could rig an entire valley with traps using nothing but scrap metal and fishing line. Said she took out a whole platoon of Taliban fighters without firing a shot. They said she was a logistician, a ghost who could see the whole chessboard. Anya picked up a cloth and resumed wiping down the bolt. Stories get exaggerated, she said quietly. But the name hung in the air. The weaver. The fit. She saw the patterns. She saw the connections. She saw the whole damn board. Davis, overhearing, stared at her with wide, reverent eyes. The clerk, the analyst, the woman they had mocked and burdened. She was a legend. They had been in the presence of a legend and had been too arrogant to see it. The respect from the team was no longer grudging. It was absolute. They followed her commands without hesitation. They rationed their last crumbs of food based on her orders. They trusted her completely. When she said, "Turn left," they turned left. When she said, "Be quiet," they held their breath. She had stripped away their pride and replaced it with something far more valuable. Survival. On the fourth day in the caves, she stopped. "We're here," she announced. She pointed her dying flashlight beam at the rock wall. It looked like any other part of the cave. The depot was built into this same cave system. The Soviets used it first. Al-Quds just expanded it. Their main entrance is on the other side of the mountain. But my analysis showed a forgotten ventilation shaft connecting the old network to the new. She ran her hands over the rock face, feeling for seams. Finally, she stopped. Here, she knocked, and the sound was hollow. Using a pry bar from Bell's pack, she and Jian worked at the edges of a section of rock that had been cleverly disguised with textured concrete. After 10 minutes of straining effort, a square section, about 3 feet by 3 feet, swung inwards with a groan of rusty hinges. The air that wafted out was dry and smelled of gun oil, plastic, and ozone. They had found it. Anya was the first one through. The shaft opened into a massive, well-lit, and well-organized underground warehouse. Crates were stacked to the ceiling. Kalashnikov's RPGs, heavy machine guns, and, just as her intel had suggested, crates and crates of manpads. There was a modern communication center in one corner, humming with power from a diesel generator whose exhaust was vented miles away. The place was a terrorist superstore. "Reyes," she said, her voice crisp. "I need an exact count of the surface-to-air missiles. Jian, inventory the medical supplies. Davis, see if you can get one of their radios working on our emergency frequency. Bell, with me. We're setting charges." The team moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Reyes, directing from a sitting position, confirmed at least 50 advanced shoulder-fired missile systems. They were in the lair. Mission accomplished. Anya and Bell worked quickly, using the enemy's own high-grade explosives. She wasn't just planting bombs. She was creating a structural cascade failure, placing charges on key support pillars and load-bearing sections of the cavern. It was demolition as an art form. As she worked, Davis shouted from the comm center. "I've got something. I've patched into their long-range antenna. I have a clean signal to Bagram." Anya strode over and took the handset. She keyed the mic. "Any station, this is Mako 3. I repeat, any station, this is Mako 3. How copy?" The reply came back almost instantly, crackling with static and relief. It was Colonel Thorne's voice, laced with fury and anxiety. "Mako 3, this is Archangel 6. Where the hell have you been, Sergeant? We lost your signal 4 days ago. I had you all listed as Kia. What is your status? Report." Anya took a calm breath. The men of Mako team stood watching her, their faces illuminated by the glow of the enemy's equipment. "Colonel," she said, her voice as steady as the rock around them. "This is Warrant Officer Sharma. Sergeant Reyes is wounded but stable. PFC Henderson is Kia. The rest of the team is operational." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. Thorne had been screaming at a sergeant he thought was in charge. He was now speaking to the clerk he had ordered sent home at the first sign of trouble. "Sharma." Thorne's voice was different now. The anger was gone, replaced by disbelief. "What is your position?" "We are inside the target. Anya replied coolly. The lair is compromised. I have a complete inventory of hostile assets, including 52 Strela-class manpads. I am transmitting the coordinates of this facility now. She nodded to Davis, who sent the encrypted data burst. We have placed charges. Recommend immediate airstrike on our signal. We have found a service exit on the north face and require extraction at these secondary coordinates in 30 minutes. How copy, Archangel? The silence from Thorn's end stretched for what felt like a lifetime. The entire command center in Bagram was likely frozen, listening to this impossible report from a ghost. The voice that finally came back was stripped of all its previous arrogance, all its bluster. It was the voice of a man who had been completely and irrevocably proven wrong. Solid copy, warrant officer, Thorn said, his tone heavy with a respect he had never shown her. Airstrike is authorized on your mark. Extraction is on its way. Bring them home, Sharma. Bring them home. Acknowledged, Archangel, Anya said and signed off. She turned to the team. Let's move. We have a deadline. 30 minutes later, huddled in a rocky alcove on the cold, windswept north side of the mountain, Anya held a small detonator in her hand. Below them, they could hear the faint whine of approaching jets. Mako team is clear, she said into her personal radio, a small device she had kept shielded from the EMP. Weaver is sending the package. She pressed the button. A deep, rumbling shudder went through the mountain beneath their feet. A plume of dust and smoke billowed from the main entrance on the far side of the peak. Then, a series of massive secondary explosions tore the heart out of the mountain as the munitions inside cooked off. The entire peak seemed to sag in on itself. The lair was gone. As the first Black Hawk helicopter appeared over the ridge, its landing lights cutting through the twilight, Sergeant Reyes looked at Anya. His face was etched with pain, but his eyes were clear. The Weaver, he said, a statement of fact. They should have just sent you in the first place. Anya simply looked at the approaching helicopter. The mission required a team, she said, and an analyst. The flight back to the FOB was quiet. The exhaustion was too deep for words. When they landed, medical teams swarmed Reyes and Davis, rushing them to the trauma bay. Colonel Thorne was waiting on the tarmac. He watched the wounded being carried off, his face grim. Then he saw Anya step out of the helicopter, her pack on her back, her rifle in her hands. She looked tired, but unbroken. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. The roar of the helicopter engines began to die down. He looked at the diminutive woman who had succeeded where his reconnaissance flights had failed, who had survived an ambush that had crippled his elite team, and who had single-handedly salvaged a catastrophic failure and turned it into a major strategic victory. He said nothing. Words were inadequate. Instead, he slowly raised his hand to his brow and rendered a sharp, perfect salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture a colonel gives a junior officer. It was a salute of profound, hard-earned respect. From one warrior to another. Anya met his gaze and returned the salute with a crisp nod. No triumph. No, I told you so, just a quiet acknowledgement. Later that night, the FOB had settled into its familiar rhythm. The sounds of generators, distant shouts, and the clank of metal were the base's heartbeat. Anya was not in the debriefing room, where the surviving members of Mako team were giving their official report. She was not in the officers' club, where tales of her exploits were already beginning to morph into legend. She was alone, in a quiet, brightly lit corner of the vast logistics warehouse, her official domain. Her pack was disassembled on a clean canvas tarp, each piece of equipment laid out in perfect order. She was cleaning her M110. Her movements were methodical, ritualistic. She cleaned the barrel, the bolt carrier group, the trigger assembly, wiping away the grime of the caves and the fine dust of the mountains. Each component was inspected, oiled, and reassembled with a watchmaker's precision. This was her ritual, her way of returning to center, of washing away the violence with the quiet dignity of maintenance. The door to the warehouse slid open, and the three able-bodied survivors of Mako team walked in. Sergeant Reyes on crutches, flanked by Jen and Bell. They were bandaged, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but they moved with a shared purpose. They walked across the concrete floor and stopped before her, forming a line. Anya didn't stop her work immediately. She finished seating the bolt back into the upper receiver, the click of the metal precise and final. Only then did she look up. Reyes's face was pale, but his eyes were steady. He didn't offer a clumsy thank you. He didn't try to apologize for his arrogance. The experience in the mountains had burned all of that away, leaving only a core of pure, unadulterated respect. He shifted his weight on his crutches and, with a pained effort, brought his hand up in a salute. Jian and Belle immediately followed suit, their arms snapping up in perfect unison. They held the salute, their eyes locked on her. It was a silent, powerful testament. They weren't saluting a warrant officer. They were saluting their savior. They were saluting the Weaver. Anya Sharma looked at their faces, at the raw sincerity in their eyes. She slowly placed her rifle on the tarp, rose to her feet, and met Reyes's gaze. She gave a short, crisp nod of acknowledgement. A simple gesture that said everything that needed to be said. I see you. We survived. Now we continue. Then, she turned back to her work. She picked up the analog compass, its casing scratched from the ordeal, and began to wipe it clean. The three Marines stood there for a moment longer, holding their salute in the quiet hum of the warehouse. Finally, Reyes lowered his hand, and the others did the same. Without another word, they turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the pool of light, a solitary figure of quiet competence, a master of a world they had never known existed, already preparing for the next mission. The sun had long set, and outside, the stars over the Afghan mountains burned with a cold, clear light.